Alex,
Yes, Sarah?
have you ever experienced performance anxiety?
You mean where you think about how every word that you're saying could be analyzed and criticized by hundreds of people who are listening around the globe?
Well, actually, I was talking about during sex.
Oh.
But now I don't want to do the podcast. Welcome to Mistakes Were Made, a podcast about non-monogamy for messy, anxious people like us. I'm Sarah. I'm a queer, non-monogamous therapist. I experience performance anxiety every time I'm expected to perform not being anxious. So, most of my life.
And I'm her husband, Alex. I'm a communications professional, a father, and I'm not really that anxious, but only because I'm heavily medicated.
And I'm Jessica, here producing, resident monogamist for the podcast. And I'm here to say, don't worry, it happens to lots of guys.
Thank you, Jessica. Just keep saying that throughout the podcast. If you haven't already guessed, today we're talking about performance anxiety. But before we start, I wanted to give some exciting news. We're going to be doing a lecture as part of the Evergreen Hearts lecture series coming up in May.
Speaking of performance anxiety.
Yeah, we haven't prepared at all. Oh, my God. I think we'll just wing it. It'll be fine.
It's a good idea. I will also just come heavily medicated.
Yeah, it's good. If you want to watch us sit on a stage and drool. No, it's going to be great. We're going to be talking about polyamory pitfalls on Thursday, May 9th at 6:30 p.m. And the tickets are already on sale. You can get tickets now at evergreenhearts.org. And it's part of an ongoing lecture series. Lecture makes it sound kind of boring. Ours is going to be fun and exciting.
An
it's
ongoing party series.
Yeah, exactly.
Party of ideas series.
Yeah. There's gonna be slides. No, there's not gonna. We're not gonna have slides, are we?
All right. So here's my plug for what we're doing.
I'm gonna throw condoms into the crowd.
Alex is
That's
we'll
what you
have
do.
a t-shirt cannon, but for condoms. And that's what
Do we have a
Alex is
t-shirt
gonna
can?
do. We're gonna get one.
Okay.
We're gonna crowdsource.
I might
for
not
one.
make it, honestly. If we have a t-shirt can, I'm just gonna be firing the t-shirt cannon in the woods or something.
But I'm excited about this because it's gonna be a version of what we do on the show where we just talk about through our experience as podcasters and mistakes were made, through our personal experience as non-monogamous people, polyamorous people, and my experience as a therapist to many non-monogamous polyamorous folks. What are some common pitfalls that people make early on in the journey? Discuss what they are, discuss why they happen, share funny stories, embarrass ourselves in the ways that our listeners have become familiar with, and then talk about how can you avoid them? Should you avoid them? Are they valuable lessons to learn on your own? Just those kinds of discussions. I think it's going to be really interesting.
So if you're a new listener or kind of new to non-monogamy, it would be a great chance to hear some of that stuff and in a little more interactive of a format. There'll be Q&A and things like that. And if you're a longtime listener, it'll be a good chance to see us talk in person and look at the dumb looks on our faces when we're talking.
And then buy us drinks afterward
Yeah,
because
exactly.
we'll be a bundle of jangled nerves.
Yeah, perfect. So May 9th, you can get tickets at evergreenhearts.org. And apparently nobody ever buys tickets to these until the last minute, and then they sell out. So buy tickets now, early.
Cool.
Early bird special. Still the same price, I think. I don't actually know how much it costs. Okay, cool. So today we're talking about... I'm freezing up. What are we talking about? I gotta go. Picture me running away. No. So yeah, we had the idea a while ago to do an episode about performance anxiety, and I think some interesting things came up. I've been thinking about it since then. Maybe to start, we can have a man-centric
Finally.
Yes,
Wow.
Finally.
Yeah.
Let's have a man-centric discussion of sexual performance anxiety.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
I do think that okay, fine. Obviously, that's the first thing that comes to mind. I was thinking about this is definitely a cultural trope, and there are a lot of cliches around it. What can you guys think of any? stupid cliches about.
Well, like, it happens to lots of guys, that conversation, right?
Yeah.
This has never happened before, which I think is actually a very offensive thing to say to someone
Right.
that you're sleeping with.
Yeah.
Like, this is the first time ever that I've...
Must be you.
Right. Because what you're supposed to say is it's not because I'm not attracted to you.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, the whole thing makes me, it's like obviously very prevalent in the culture, and in people's, prevalent in the culture because it's prevalent in people's individual experience. And so I did some research because, of course, I don't have any personal experience
Yes, of course.
with it whatsoever.
But as
Just from a scientific perspective.
anthropological perspective here.
Exactly.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah. So I did some research, and it's like erectile dysfunction, ED as they like to call it, affects 50% or more of men over 40, and as much as a quarter of men under 40. But it's kind of interesting, like when you start reading about it, a lot of the like sort of literature about it really like pathologizes it as like a thing that you have or you don't have, like a disease. And it's like, I now have erectile dysfunction. Like it's like a disease that you got or something like that. And I think part of that's just because of the way that the like medical system works. They're like, you have a disease. How can we solve that for you? And charge your healthcare provider money or prescribe you a drug for it or whatever. But as I look deeper into like what was around that, there's like a lot of different causes, and there are sort of more physiological causes. And again, we're gonna like get into more of the nuance, but right now we're just talking about like not getting and maintaining erections when you want to, when you are a penis having person, right?
I mean, I would throw in there also not being able to orgasm.
Right.
Whether or not you have an erection, which I think is also a way that this shows up.
Yeah, and I think that's like a less sort of treated or treatable or like medically acknowledged thing, but it's
I would
certainly
say,
a
like,
thing.
anecdotally, it feels like a thing, and
Yeah.
also just among people that I talk to in my practice. And we'll get into this, but I think in both cases there are connections to whether or not you're on antidepressants or
Yeah.
SSRIs and other types of psychopharmaceuticals.
Yeah. For the erection one, it's like they're talking about it being, it can be rooted in like circulatory system, blood flow, pulmonary health related things, and it can be related to like nervous system related things, and it can be also kind of more rarely related to hormonal things. But then there's this whole business of like selling men testosterone therapy as a response to erectile issues, that seems to be like a very lucrative industry, but not really one that it doesn't actually work. It's kind of like, I think it works really well for a lot of men to be like, just give me more testosterone.
But it's sort of snake oil.
Yeah, I think it does kind of like Eric Fitzmedred, who we had on the podcast a couple episodes ago, talks about this in his book, and I think he deals with it a fair amount in his practice, and he like breaks down a little bit in the book like the percentages of people who actually end up like getting that therapy and having positive results related to sexual performance as a result, and it's like the numbers are very low.
Interesting.
So it's
Okay.
very it's can sometimes be a hormonal issue, but usually it's not. It's like there's a specific sort of syndrome of low testosterone that not very many people have, and it's way more people are treating themselves or being treated for low testosterone than actually have that as a problem.
It's interesting that works from a marketing perspective for, I think, like a cultural narrative reason that we'll probably be getting into, which is just this idea of manliness.
Right.
And that having ED or experiencing any kind of performance anxiety or any struggles in that department is a lack of manliness. And
Right.
we're like, testosterone equals manliness. This is a manliness problem. We'll give them testosterone and they'll be more manly.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, and there's some like really interesting things to like read about what testosterone actually does and what it actually is. It's more of a competition hormone than anything else. Like that's how I've heard it best described. Certainly like women have it, as do men. Like, men have estrogen and testosterone, women have estrogen and testosterone, and all of these other hormones. It's just like the proportion that you have them. And of course, there are like in between, folks who have different amounts, and people get testosterone therapy when they're transitioning and blah, 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 blah. But it's just like not so cut and dry, or so like, if you're not feeling like as much of a man, then just jack up your testosterone and you'll have a hard dick and, whatever. It doesn't really work like that.
Yeah. I definitely am outside of my area of knowledge when we're talking about hormones, and many people would know a lot more about it. But what I do understand about them is that they're pretty mysterious and far more complex than the cultural narratives would lend us to believe. And that they interact with people's systems in really kind of like unique ways. So we talked about all these possible sort of medical, physiological causes for having a hard time getting an erection. And then there's another big one that is like a psychological cause. And interestingly, like there's this article from the Cleveland Clinic that we can link in the show notes that gives a really good overview of all of this stuff that I would recommend if you just like are sort of interested in reading the general thing. It also has some great anatomical diagrams of a flaccid penis and a penis with a boner. That come for that and then stay for the good information. Yeah, it's right at the top. But then they talk about how, quote, it's normal to have trouble getting or keeping an erection for 20% of sexual encounters, and that would not qualify you as a person who has diagnosable ED. So like that really stuck out for me because I think this is like, it's basically saying like, this is the experience of most men, most people with penises. Like, it's not strange to a fifth of the time that you're having sex not have your dick do exactly what you want it to do when you want it to do that. And there might be a lot of different, like sometimes physiological reasons for it, or sometimes psychological reasons for it, but they're not, what's the word? It's not like a chronic, sort of diagnosable condition. It's just like the way that our bodies are. Which again speaks to that hypermasculinity and the kind of toxic masculinity overlaps here in a lot of these narratives, that if you are not ready for sex on demand at any given moment, then there is something wrong with you as a man. Like that we are so sensitive to any deviation from that narrative that we're like, oh no, this has happened a handful of times. There must be something wrong. And in fact, most people with penises would report that it was typical to happen as much as 20% of the time without it being diagnosable condition.
And that's part of what is like, quote unquote, normal sex would involve that happening. And then from there, I just feel like it's important to like acknowledge then that like, if that's happening, our standard and that sort of hypermasculine performance expectation is like driven by culture and by like porn, and like the people who are acting in porn are like typically probably, I mean, I don't know the industry, but I imagine, isn't it commonly understood that like those people are all on drugs?
What do you mean? You mean like performance enhancing drugs?
They're on performance enhancing drugs, and they're like doing all this stuff to be able to do that.
Probably. I mean, again, I think that's something that I've sort of like heard in an atmospheric way around porn, but I don't know that for sure, but probably.
Yeah. Or I suppose they're superlative in the same way that, dramatic actors are superlatively good dramatic actors, and I wouldn't expect myself to be a dramatically good
and
superlatively good dramatic actor or a superlatively good basketball player.
They're
whatever, right?
editing the pornography to depict a sort of idealized version of sex.
Yeah. So point being, don't hold yourself to that standard. And, I was joking earlier when I said I've never experienced this. I would say I'm definitely in that like 20% of the time, things don't go exactly the way that you want them to.
So talk to me. Is it okay for me to ask a few questions here? You've like given...
Absolutely. Stop the tape right now.
Thank you for introducing this issue and for kind of talking through a baseline of some of the medical, cultural parameters, I guess, especially from the male perspective or the perspective and experience of people with penises. My question for you is, why were you so interested and eager to tackle this topic in the podcast? It was sort of in a larger list of topics that we might explore, and I'll admit, and you can ask me questions about this in a moment, it was not my favorite or first choice.
Yeah.
And you really like lobbied hard for this being, if you will,
I will.
for this to be our next one.
Yeah.
Why is this topic important to you? Why do you think it's important to talk about?
I think because of the like generally understanding the stigma, and then the more things that I read about it, the more times it came up. Like it comes up in the Better Man book that Eric Fitzgerald wrote a bunch, and like in ways that really resonated with me. I'm reading the book The Ice Storm,
which you've heard us reference on this podcast.
I think we referenced the movie, but now I'm reading the book, and in the book she's talking about, he's talking through one of the characters about how the genesis of the infidelity in their relationship is an occurrence of like impotence is the word they're using, but same thing, where the husband like is too drunk and like has like a performance issue with his wife, and then he just like withdraws, and they like basically never have sex again.
Wow.
And is talking about like, I mean, I'm not sure if the whole passage is worthwhile, but she says like, she's like quoting a book. In essence, this book is like set in the 70s, but it's like, this initial crisis, whether caused by the traditional drinking, provokes desire but affects performance, or by anxiety, other mental factors, so frighten men that thereafter they frequently incline towards celibacy. In their indignity and remorse, they claim to be uninterested. So it's just like speaking to how like big of the stigma around this like is having this like really big emotionally destructive force for like, obviously those are like fictional characters, but I think based on fact, and I think this is kind of still happening to people. And
there we have, I guess I want to go ahead and say, I think we have really fragile sexual egos.
Yeah.
And this is one of the ways that it shows up, and it's really hard for us to talk about, and I think it causes a lot of suffering.
Yeah. And then like you can draw a line from like that being said in the 70s, and then like it's written in the 90s, and then like when we were in our like formative years, it's like Viagra came out, and like fucking Jay Leno making like Viagra jokes all the time, and like it just like is a thing that has been very, it's not treated in a way that is like really realistic, is like so out of sync with like what is actually happening, how many people it's apparently sort of impacting, and then the ways that is like affecting those people's relationships. It felt like an important thing for me to talk about.
Because it feels really taboo, misunderstood, intentionally obscured.
Yeah.
And whenever you're in that realm, you're like, wait, what is the culture trying to force on us here? It makes you feel like you're being policed, but you don't even know how. And
probably being policed into some weird version of masculinity and patriarchy, and I don't even...
Or just like assumptions about sex having to be reproductive and not centering like pleasure or connectivity or joy.
Right. And then in the non-monogamy context, I've talked to a lot of people who had kind of similar experiences that I did when we first opened our relationship, and like the first time that you're... having sex with somebody who you're not used to having sex with, basically, having a hard time getting an erection, like that first time. And it's like this build up to like, I'm going to sleep with somebody else for the first time in like however many years, because I've been in a monogamous relationship for like 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years. And then like, it doesn't go the way that you expect it to. And like, almost every man who I've had a conversation about that with has had kind of the same story about that being a difficult experience in that way. And it came up in the episode we did with Vaughn Wolf, the Ask a Sex Worker episode. She talked about how like that is a very common thing for, I think she was talking about with her clients, or maybe people coming to her because of that. Do you remember that?
I think she was talking about how a common client who comes to her is somebody who is like, I'm having sex with new people for the first time, or maybe I've opened up my relationship and that's why, or maybe I'm exploring my sexuality and that's why, and I want some practice. in a new sexual context.
Yeah.
Because of performance anxiety.
Yeah. So yeah, like acknowledging that brain-body connection, how big of an issue how common of an issue this is going to be, and how kind of not that big of a deal it should be. Feels like an important thing to talk about.
Yeah. And unearthing some of the hidden agenda there, the hidden cultural agenda.
Yeah.
Which I think is already beginning to surface a little bit.
Yeah. What do you think the hidden cultural agenda is?
Well, some of the things that we've already touched on already. I think one of it is the way it controls men and male sexuality, which is supposed to be really oriented towards like a kind of hypersexuality that is always being directed often towards reproduction. Like the idea of focusing on male or penis erections and orgasms is like to kind of center reproduction as the point of sex. So I think there might be something there. But I think it's also about like disconnecting men from that body brain connection in their sexuality. That in fact, like toxic masculinity is telling men that your dick, your body is disconnected from your brain. And in fact, it's just kind of a sex machine.
Right.
And that's what it's there for. And it would be feminine and queer and sort of unsettling and undesirable for you to connect your feelings to that or your thoughts to that in a significant way. So I think there's some of that policing going on. I think there's a fair amount of just like heteronormativity happening there, which just defines sex as penis and vagina for reproduction. That's what sex really is, and everything else is kind of a sideshow. Because
and so the penis has to be hard for that to happen. So that's why that's the most important thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you can talk about, certainly people have noticed that, and we'll be segueing into maybe the female experience of this or the queer experience of this.
Nah.
Maybe at some point. But even the fact that Viagra exists, or there is a bunch of medication that exists to address this issue for people with penises, but not to address this issue, which does also exist for people with vulvas and vaginas. So I think that tells you a lot about where the values are and why.
Yeah.
So I think that's all part of the policing. And then I would just like go maybe a step further and say sex for the point of connecting with people, sex for the point of joy, sex for the point of pleasure, sex for the point of, that kind of exploration, I think makes this culture really uncomfortable. I think they want sex to be either in this one box that is about like reinforcing reproduction and heteronormativity and the gender binary, or they want it to be in this very specific taboo box where it's like, a certain kind of pornography or a certain kind of adultery. Like these are kind of the two speeds that the culture will allow, and you kind of access them differently based on what your gender is. But just the idea that it would be a normal, complex, individualized expression of being alive. No, I don't think the culture likes that.
Right. And from the standard of from the sort of cultural standard, most sex is probably actually either intentionally off script or a sort of comical disaster as compared to those standards. You know what I mean? Like most of the sex that people are actually having, like imagine somebody who's like fantasizing about, stepping out on their partner and they're going to like commit adultery for the first time or something like that. Right. And they're going to like get with this person who they've like had all of this sexual tension with for a long time. And then they like get into the situation where they're doing that. Like, I bet you most of the time when they do that, like the dick's not hard.
Oh,
right?
I would say, at least from the perspective of being a therapist to people, I can confirm that that's the case for most people, that infidelity is not like it's depicted cinematically. And it's not like, oh, finally we've just like let ourselves go and with abandon we're having the most superlative sexual experience of our lives.
Yeah.
No.
Right. And I think that kind of gets back to the some of the like sort of psychological factors there, and I think maybe it's worth digging into that a little bit. Like, what are the things that make it really hard for your body to function the way that you want it to.
Or even that paradigm is something that's worth challenging. Like, is it your body malfunctioning? Or is it just the way your body is in that situation? And is there something to pathologize about that? Or is it just fine?
Right.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's so real that we're so uncomfortable with the possibility of embracing the fact that having sex with a new person for the first time might be awkward and uncomfortable, and that's like normal. That's not something to be pathologized, right? Or whatever, or just that like on any given day it's not happening for whatever reason, like, you know, sure, maybe you just want to medicate that away, or maybe you want to like have a conversation about your feelings and see what's going on.
Or maybe you just want to have sex or physical intimacy in a different way.
Exactly.
Because I think there's a certain lens of ableism here, and I'm maybe not the most knowledgeable person to speak to that. But again, there's this assumption that the body is supposed to work a certain way at a certain time for a certain reason, and any deviation from that is a pathology that needs to be corrected and should feel shameful and wrong. And I wonder if there's not even just like a paradigm shift to be had here, which is like, all right, so the dick's not hard, or we're not going to have an orgasm.
Right.
So what? Are we not still having sex? Are we not still enjoying ourselves? Are we not still connecting and learning about ourselves and each other? Is that a problem? This is an honest question. I'm
Right.
asking.
Yeah. I think
I want to hear from you guys.
Yeah.
Is that a problem?
Well, it's, I mean, this whole conversation, it's so sad. It just is like making me picture poor little disembodied penises that are expected to do, you know, that are just like totally separate, right? And we do sort of have this other problematic acceptance of like female sexuality as being like mysterious, right? And impossible to understand. I mean, I personally don't feel that way, but I feel like that's the stereotype, right? Yeah. And so it's just so sort of flattening and limiting of male sexuality to define it as only this one thing. And then therefore flattening and limiting of like everyone's sexuality, since that gets to be sort of the, you know how in science they're always doing things where in studies they're just like the female subjects are just like males but weird, right?
Yes,
like they don't
that's
actually
right, yeah.
study the female specimens. You know, I think that this conversation is just making me think about that.
Right. Then I also wonder if there isn't just something about a narrative arc here for people where they're like, well, when the penis comes, you stop. When
Right.
otherwise would you stop?
Right. There is a very natural narrative arc.
Right.
There, I will say that.
I think about this
I wonder
because
which
it's
came first.
Familiar.
I was thinking about this because we went to Hump, which is in Seattle. It's like a famous amateur porn festival, essentially, and kind of like famous for representing different types of sexuality, different types of sex from people who are not professional porn stars. Although I would argue that a lot of them seemed like they were people who were professional porn stars.
Yeah.
And
There was a
they're
lot
like
of
on OnlyFans.
yeah.
That's a professional porn star now.
Right.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a gripe, an aside. But I was definitely struck in, 2 hours of porn how the penis coming was the end or the point
Yeah.
of 90% of the porn.
Right.
Which is how it is in traditional porn.
Which is how it is in traditional porn, too.
A graphic representation of the penis coming.
And I was like, wow, this is like a lot of penises coming.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of leads into something that I wanted to say, like, in response to everything that, like, I think everything that you all just said is valid, and also we should be, like, compassionate for people, like, everybody has internalized all of those
Absolutely,
narratives.
yeah.
So the idea that I'm just going to like transcend the idea that my dick should be hard during sex and that it's a failure if that's not the case, that's not something that I'm just going to do
Totally.
through the power of, my mind or whatever.
Well, and to be clear, you asked me how did I feel like the culture was policing us through
Yeah.
these narratives. And that was my response. It wasn't like that we should individually just evolve past it. But
Yeah.
it's like, no,
Right.
I think this is that the culture is training us.
Yeah.
And
So it's that same
this is
thing
why,
of like
yeah.
kind of trying to transcend the like think about what the ideal place you might want to be is, and also acknowledge what the sort of real place where you are is.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about how women experience this, but first I want you to ask me some more questions about how I have experienced it.
Okay, great. Well, I'm curious. I can do that. I think I'll do it from a little bit of an around, which is, what does it mean to be good at sex to you? Like, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I guess like the sort of impulsive, not woke answer
I'm
is...
not looking for the woke answer.
Yeah, you're looking for the impulsive answer is like being like strong and like being able to perform on demand, like we've been talking about, and being able to satisfy your partner and things like that.
To be strong, to perform on demand, and to satisfy your partner.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. What do you notice about that list as you say it?
That there are things that don't really have to do with my own gratification or centering my own feelings.
Yeah, I was really
They're like
struck
very
by that.
externalized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that there is a lot of pressure
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
around that. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of using myself as a foil here, but those are certainly like things that are available to me. Yeah.
And so, kind of having identified that, and we'll probably explore it a little further, I'm curious, how does this issue show up for you in your sex life? You've talked about why it felt culturally important, but why is it important for you?
Because I've noticed that it's like a thing that I've struggled with and felt like a really big deal in ways that I sort of later determined to be very like kind of fleeting and very related to the situation. And so I think the more that you let it feel like this big, horrible, huge deal, the more damaging it could potentially be, like we were sort of talking about with the ice storm example. And when you're sort of like more accepting and taking some of the more like accepting approaches, then it becomes much less of a deal. So like, to be more specific, I would say like when we first started dating other people, there were definitely like the first time I was with other people, or maybe like the second or third time, like I had like an erection issue or whatever, and it just totally didn't work out. And that like, and then when we kind of went from, I had a partner who I didn't use condoms with at the beginning. And then when we sort of like decided like, oh, we're just going to like use condoms with every other partner, that became again an issue. Like, and I think this is a thing that people deal with a lot. I've heard people tell me like, I just can't use condoms because it's like too hard to like maintain an erection while I'm putting on a condom.
Yeah, I've heard that one too.
Yeah. This is not.
You couldn't hear it, but Jessica and I just winked at each other.
It was the loudest wink. A wink heard around the world. That was not an endorsement of that idea, but it is a thing that people say. And it is like, it's certainly like stopping in the middle gives you a moment to be like, it's psychologically like, now I have to do this thing. I hope my boner doesn't go away while I do this thing. And then the harder you think about that, the more likely it is your boner will go away while you do that thing. So there's that piece. And then to continue on the overshare narrative of oversharing that we're doing here. And then I got a prescription for, essentially Viagra. I think the generic name is Sildenafil. And I like used it sometimes situationally in those situations. And I would say that now when I am with a new partner for the first time, I would say a decent proportion of the time, there's like some kind of struggle, or I sort of get in my head about it a little bit. And I think now I kind of know to not like really worry about it too much and just be like, let's take a break and like do some other stuff for a while. And it like works fine. And so I guess I want to share all of this to kind of say it would be nice to have kind of known that that's okay at the beginning of that journey.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying it's important to you to talk about because you easily experienced a shame spiral around it early on, and you suspect other people, especially men and people with penises, are too, especially in the context of opening up for the first time.
Yeah.
And you're like, if anybody could just like learn a little bit from me and spare themselves some of that shame,
Yeah.
I would like to help make that happen.
Yeah. And the people that you're with probably do not, like in a sort of het context, the women that you're with, and you can like endorse this or deny it in a minute, probably are probably much more concerned about being on the edges of your shame spiral than they are about whether or not your dick's hard. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. And like how sort of quote unquote successful your sex is. Right. And so it's pretty, I think, important to like figure out how to manage those feelings internally and or together, and like know that there are a lot of other things that you can do and ways that you can like work through that, and that it's not all about showing up and like performing in that way. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Which I think is a similar thing to what I was saying when you were like, you shouldn't put so much pressure on people to evolve. And I'm like, well, that's what you just described.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to argue with you. I was just
being defensive.
Well, I didn't mean to be defensive. Now my boner is completely gone, Sarah.
Okay.
Well,
yes, Jessica.
I mean,
Jump on in here.
This is why we keep you around.
Yeah, right. I feel like, an idea that I'm hearing here is the idea of sort of how hard it can be to remember, pun intended? No, not pun intended. To remember.
Wow. Yeah, that was a deep track.
Sorry. That sex is a collaborative project, right? Sex with another person, I suppose. But it can be so easy to go into a shame spiral like you're describing, which is a very like, that's only happening for you, right? You're not letting your partner in on what's going on, right? Where instead it's like making me think of that idea of like the meta conversation that again we talked about with Eric Fitzmedrud, and that when we can like go back to that to remember like this is a thing we're doing together. It's not a thing that I am doing to you or you are doing to me. That we can get through this.
I am an Aquarius, and so sometimes I feel like my approach to these things is like I am an alien in a human suit. And I just like am sitting on some distant planet being like, but wait, why were we doing any of this? And I think...
How about we just don't? What? Are you saying that about the podcast, or...
I'm saying that about literally fucking everything. But I think there's this Hall of Mirrors aspect to this that like fills me with a kind of existential nausea that I like struggle to sit with. And I think that's one of the reasons why I got defensive. And I was like, can we talk about this in a cultural political context? Because that's where I feel safer. And it's a way of addressing my own existential nausea. Because people being together naked with the intention of having sex and pleasuring themselves and each other so quickly getting like kind of triggered into shame spirals about how they're being perceived by the other person, and thus immediately having the opposite experience of the intended experience. Like moving further and further into themselves and away from each other in a way that is like a reactive to each little bit of insecurity or shame or defensiveness that someone feels depresses me so much. I mean, I think that's why nobody's asked me yet why I didn't want to do this episode. So let me just go ahead.
Yeah, why didn't you want to do this episode?
And share why the fuck I didn't want to do this episode.
The first time this has ever happened. If you give a good enough argument, we will just stop recording.
Can we just stop this and let me go back to Planet Aquarius? Leave me the fuck alone.
Just gonna walk out.
It's like flip the table.
I'm just going to stay here and tearfully recount my erectile dysfunction experiences alone.
This is when a Pisces and an Aquarius are in love. It's a really perfect description. Okay. I mean, first of all, I was really, I was moved by your description of why you wanted to do it. And I appreciate you sharing that. And I, in that moment, kind of came down from planet Aquarius, if you will. And I was like, oh, right, because this is a really human experience. And Alex, you're willing to be vulnerable about it in ways that most people aren't, including most partners that I've had, to try and transcend some of this shame and actually like reground what we're doing here and why, right? Which I think is really wonderful, and I'm appreciating it. So thank you for pushing me to do it. Now,
you're welcome.
Why I don't want to do it is because it's so fucking depressing.
What's depressing about it?
Depressing.
It's depressing to me that all of the cops that live in our heads, I think, that keep us from just being present with ourselves and each other, which presumably a lot of the sex we're having, that's why we're doing it. Most of the sex that we're having as human beings is not to make a baby.
Right.
Most of the
God
sex
forbid.
Please. No, that the point for having sex, presumably, the stated point, is that you want to have a pleasurable, fun experience with other people, you know, be present for it and authentic. And I think, like, it makes me sad that there are so many cops in our heads that are keeping us from doing that. And how prevalent that is, and how hard it is to talk about, and how quickly you get into that hall of mirrors, and how easily it is like, well, I don't care about my experience, I just want the other person's experience to be good, because if their experience is good, then it validates that I have some value in this, and then they're doing exactly the same thing, and then you've just, like, spun off down the hall of mirrors, and you're alone. And I feel like a lot of my, if I'm being vulnerable and personal here, more than a few of my relationships, especially with men, have not worked out, in part because of this type of dynamic and how hard it was to talk about it. And how I think I personally feel it a little bit like a failure, because I have tried and not succeeded in talking about it or interrupting it with them. So I think there's like a little bit of, there's the existential nausea that I feel here, but there's a little bit of hopelessness that I feel. And I think that it touches on that. And that's one of the reasons why it's not like my favorite topic. Though I will say, as a therapist, I recognize what an important topic this is. And it is something that I talk about with my clients, certainly every day that I'm in the office. So.
Are you saying that performance anxiety has affected those relationships, or?
I would say, you know, it's kind of hard to entirely separate out what's happening. It's like, if you're not having good sexual communication, that can be showing up in a lot of ways, and it can be hard to repair for a lot of reasons, or it can be hard to establish for a lot of reasons. But I would say it feels like it has been an element in some of the more, like, I don't know, just less sort of sadder endings, if you will, to relationships for me. I don't know. That's like sad endings, happy endings.
The opposite of a happy ending.
Or just like, it's really hard to talk about desire or to try something different without people feeling defensive, or without, in my case, me getting like sort of shy quickly and be like, well, I don't want to make people uncomfortable, you know?
Specifically with men or with women as well? Because I don't know if our listeners know, but you're bisexual.
I am bisexual. I would say it's mostly been with men. Yeah. And I think that this, for anyone who is a loyal listener of this podcast, I imagine there's almost a recognizable tone that I get when I start talking about some of the feelings of sadness that I have about my experience of some of those types of dynamics with men, that these scripts that we fall into, and how hard it is for us to disrupt them and connect with each other past them, and how urgently I want to try, and how often I feel like I have not succeeded or have failed. And this is definitely one of them. Yeah.
I have one comment and then a follow-up question. I wonder how much this shows up more in a non-monogamy context, because it is kind of by definition often more sex-centric or sex-forward. I mean, depending on like the sort of different ways that you're practicing it, but like a lot of people are, you know, sex is kind of the driving force for the sort of reason for the connection for people in non-monogamy. And so then it puts
increasingly a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah. And it puts a lot of pressure on the sex, and then like working backwards from there, you know, if things don't go well or the communication isn't good or the, you know, performance isn't good, quote unquote, then it does sort of leave you in this existential place of like, oh, we did all this work to like forge this connection and find each other so that we could do this thing, and then doing the thing.
But the sex was awkward, so
yeah. Oh
never
well.
mind.
And if you're in more of a like romantic dating context, then that is not necessarily the most important thing, right? And you have a little bit more time and like grace and engagement to work through some of that stuff, and it's less likely that you would be like, oh well, like you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, my hope is that plenty of non-monogamous people, myself included, think of romance as a important part of our relationships, and I think that's true for you too.
Yeah. Many do, but
not everyone.
Not everyone,
Many
and
do,
also
but I do.
even in those cases, I would argue that maybe sex is more emphasized in a lot of those cases, and or you're doing it with more people, so you're spending less time. You have less bandwidth to build the romantic sort of scaffolding that
Right.
might allow for more
Trust, intimacy, context, exploration.
that makes the sex part work a little bit better.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think that's insightful. It makes me think about something, a person who was a very early date connection of mine when we opened up, and he and I we didn't end up dating, but he and I have stayed in contact over the years, and he listens to the show and often texts me his thoughts about it. And one of the things that he was texting me about, or we were texting about, was this idea of like why sex is so overemphasized in polyamory, and how obnoxious it is. And, you know, we kind of were going back and forth, circling around some of the same things that you just said there, that sex is like the excuse for the connection. It's the reason why, and so it like has to be emphasized. Otherwise, it's like, what are you doing here? How is this actually non-monogamy? Why would this relationship matter? Sex is the stakes, right? Sex is what makes the relationship something other than friendship. Sex is something that makes the relationship have higher stakes or be raised in importance, right? Or elevated in importance. And he was saying that he actually thinks that there is this like hidden powerful taboo in the idea that relationships can be transformatively important and not center sex. He was like, in a way, I feel like that is something that the culture really doesn't like, because then there is like no frame of reference for why this like community building or why this relationship could be life-alteringly important. And that has implications beyond the nuclear family towards community building and collectivism that are potentially very radical. So this is a little bit of rabbit hole. Again, I'm on Planet Aquarius, where I'm like, yeah, this is making me uncomfortable. So I'm going to go do some like weird political analysis.
How about we don't have sex at all?
How about we don't have sex at all? And
That's the most taboo thing there is.
That's a classic.
Nice try, Sarah.
Really sounds
Nice
like
try.
something I would say. Which would give everyone the impression that I don't like sex. Which I also feel really like sort of miscast and misunderstood by in all of this, because I do like sex a lot and I like having sex with
She loves it.
lots of people a lot. And,
Total slut.
but there's something about all of this like little constellation of feelings and ideas and pressures and the overemphasis and the scripts that we follow that is really unsatisfying and even distressing to me.
Can I ask, I was saying that I was going to be man-centric. And you've talked about we've talked a lot about that, and then we've talked about the sort of like maybe gender neutral stuff. What is the like female experience of this, and is there like a sort of female bodied parallel I guess we've talked maybe a little bit, maybe there's more to say about like the female experience of men's performance anxiety in sex, but also like what is the female experience of it, if there is one?
God, what to even say? But like, if you remember an old Dan Savage joke that was like something like, you know, if we're defining like your virginity or like having sex as like having an orgasm, right? Ejaculating, right? That counts as sex. Nothing else counts as sex. He's like, there's women with 12 children who are virgins.
Yeah.
That's right. I remember that.
Right. So, yeah.
I mean, so it's like
The
there
vagina
doesn't even
isn't
get to
functional
be-
or dysfunctional based on its orgasm.
Right.
According to this cultural narrative.
Right.
The vagina is functional and uterus is functional or dysfunctional based on its reproductive viability.
Right. It's just like female pleasure is not really like part of the conversation in the same way. Like it hasn't even been medicalized in the same way. Even though I think I remember hearing that things like Viagra will actually have similar effects for women, right? Like that women can just straight up take Viagra and it increases arousal or whatever in the same ways. Anyways, this is like a sort of, I don't know. I'm just like overwhelmed actually.
It's
by,
a little
like,
overwhelming.
How to even tackle it.
To be asked is a little overwhelming.
I'm sorry. Never mind. Forget I asked.
I'm having performance anxiety.
Yeah, right.
Can we just delete this all?
I'm going to try and answer this in the most frank and graphic ways that I possibly can because
Cool.
that is not something that I am always great at.
Ooh, I think
on
you're
the
going to be
podcast.
great at
So
this.
I'm going to challenge myself here.
You're going to do it.
How do I experience performance anxiety? How do other like, female-bodied people experience performance anxiety as I encounter it in like gossip or in as a therapist? I think there is a lot of anxiety about not coming. So it is worth saying that is something that female-bodied people and women are worried about
Yeah.
for similar reasons. Like it feels good and you want to do it, but it's also like a connective, fun experience, and it's seen as kind of the point of sex.
Yeah.
And you feel like if you can't do that, then you've sort of failed in that department.
If you watch like mainstream porn, the women are constantly coming.
Right. Which again, everybody's different. But I find that to be, so this actually ties to that anxiety. I find that to be so much pressure. I feel like sometimes I'm with men who are like, I know about your anatomy and I care about you coming, and so I am going to make you come as many times as possible. And I'm like, please don't.
Yeah.
Please don't do that. It's like I almost feel someone I was talking to was like, you feel like a slot machine? And I was like, I do a little bit. Like, and I don't know, like there's some physiological stuff. Like my physiology is built so coming is kind of accessible and available to me often, which doesn't actually always mean that it's a super pleasurable experience, because I think, as I've talked about on this podcast before, sometimes my version of that Hall of Mirrors is that I will just kind of disassociate and be like, okay, I'm going to come now, or I'm going to come multiple times because I know that this is important to my partner. And so I'm just going to like sort of squeeze my eyes shut and like do that because I know that then they'll be satisfied. And that in and of itself is like not a great feeling or experience. And I have often struggled to like articulate that, or what that's like for me or why it bothers me. But
Yeah, which is not that far away from a male experience sometimes too.
yeah, I've sometimes wondered that actually. And I think like some men that I've been with, I think to their credit, because they're so aware of that stereotype, like the Dan Savage stereotype of women with 12 kids still being virgins because they've never come, it's really important to them that they're like good lovers in that way or good partners in that way, and that they're like centering your pleasure. But then I think it can be corrupted by these cops in our heads also, where it stops being actually about like my embodied experience and it's about their ego.
Yeah.
And like that, again, that's when I just escaped to Planet Aquarius because I can't deal with the human suit anymore. And I'm just like, human suit, do the thing that everybody likes, you know, because this is like too sad.
Yeah. I mean, and that script is just so linear too. It's so,
Yeah.
dare I say, capitalistic.
Yeah, tell me why it seems like that to you.
I mean, because it just sort of flattens everything to be so transactional. You know, it's just like making, you know, in this investment of my time and energy or whatever, and we need to get this many orgasms out of it, and I've got a meeting in 12 minutes.
Right.
So
The KPI.
What are the KPIs on this relationship? We measure it in orgasms.
You got an MBA, Jessica. That's what you're talking about.
I mean, we could make like a pivot table about this.
Now you're talking. Now you're getting me going.
Yeah, that's very interesting and apt, and I really appreciate it.
It is like it's like a tallyable integer or whatever. Fuck.
Fucking Christ. See, it's like the cops in our heads. It's so depressing.
Yeah.
And it gets talked about that way too, like when you talk about the sort of like orgasm inequality between men and women, like it also is just again so
Right.
like tallyable.
Yeah. Well, and then you'll hear
Like-
like people be like, I made her come 12 times or
Right.
whatever, or like I came this many times.
Yeah. I owe you one. You owe me one. Whatever. Like,
Yeah.
ugh,
Doesn't feel great.
no.
No. And like, I think, you know, speaking from experience, like it doesn't feel great when that stuff is not, when you're out of sync or those dynamics are like not communicated well around and are dominating your relationship. And also I've been in relationships that, you know, like didn't have a lot of orgasms in them that were
Same.
still sexual relationships, and those relationships were great. You know, and like it's not like there wasn't some of this stuff lurking on the edges where you're like, well, I wish that it was more like that.
Right.
But it's not, you know, people are different. The way that our bodies work are different.
And we can be loved and appreciated
Yeah.
and experienced in all of those ways. I mean, I
Right.
think that's where ableism feels.
Yeah, this is where we have
Yeah.
things to learn from queer people, trans people, disabled people, people who are having all these sorts of different experiences that are redefining what is quote unquote successful sex or like good sex, because it's not just a rock hard dick jackhammering in and out of a pulsating vagina or whatever.
That produces 12 babies.
God, I don't think
At once.
You're really hung up on the babies thing. I don't think anybody wants babies to be produced in these things.
You know, I think it's probably relevant for me on this particular day because 6 years ago I was actually producing a baby from my body on this day. So I'm thinking a lot about that.
It was
connection.
amazing. I don't think sexy was the word I would use to describe it.
How very dare you, sir? I looked amazing.
Yeah, she did. She looked great.
Okay, so this is maybe a tangent, but I find it helpful. And then I don't feel like I've actually finished my description of my performance anxiety experiences
Okay.
and my frank recounting of them. But you know what that KPI orgasm equation made me think of? It made me think of all the time that we have spent in foreign countries where people would accuse us of being Yankees. And one of the ways that we would be getting accused of being Yankees was, and I remember someone saying this to me very specifically, he was like, why won't Americans ever just let me buy them dinner? Right? Like, just let me buy you dinner. Let me show you hospitality. Don't try and pay for half of it. Don't try and pay in turn the exact amount. Don't keep a tally of it. Just let me
So you're saying
express
don't
generosity.
try to make me come, just let me
Experience the
be,
pleasure of
be
coming.
your come.
No! Oh my God. There was no way that you were going to get through this episode without saying that.
Oh, sorry. What was your point? I'm trying to clarify.
No. My point was just like that idea of the measurable units and of like being in hock to people and like your value kind of constantly being calculated and how much you might owe someone or someone might
Got it.
owe
Yeah.
you
Okay.
is just like so deeply embedded in our white supremacist capitalist patriarchal culture that this is like, I feel like gets
Yeah.
invades even this
Yeah.
most intimate space. And
Yeah.
sucks. And so
Yeah.
maybe that metaphor is a bit
Yeah.
of a stretch, but I just was thinking about how in like hospitality cultures, they would always be like, no, don't No,
We're not going to split the check.
We're not going to split the
disgusting.
check, and I don't expect you to. I had you over to my mother's house. Please do not offer me money for that. Like, what are you,
Right.
a fucking psycho?
Right.
And
Yeah.
I'm like, yes, we are.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And on the other hand, I think also, but I want to like bring in the idea that also like sometimes people do want their partners to, sometimes they want their partners to leave them the fuck alone about whether they came or not and are going to come or not, men and women. And sometimes people want their partners to put in effort to help them come as well. And they should fucking ask for that and do what they're asked and communicate about that.
Well, and I think
all
it's
of
the
those things are
communication
fine.
piece. Yeah.
Yeah.
All of those things are fine. I think the communication around it is incredibly difficult for people, especially. I think especially in some of these scripts about what is good sex, who is a good lover, what does it look like, and if you were a good lover, if you were having good sex, you don't have to communicate about it.
Right.
It's just
Fucking
good.
bullshit. Yeah.
You know, and it's
Yeah.
like that's not
No.
a
Like
thing.
if you're having sex and like one person comes and the other person doesn't come, I actually saw a great post about this where there was like, your partner did an orgasm, what should you say to them? And I can't remember exactly what the things are, but they were like really, I'll find it and we can share it in the show notes. They were like really good things to say that we're not like putting a bunch of pressure on them, but we're sort of offering. And now I'm losing my train of thought.
You're like, and now you're just Alex is like, now I'm imagining what those offerings might be. Okay, back
no,
to-
they weren't
come on,
specific
come on,
things
Alex.
like that. They were phrasings. Yeah, it's just like so much communication stuff. And like same thing with like, you know, a penis not performing the way that you want it to. Like, if that happens, like, ask the person with the penis, like, what do they want? You know? Do they want to take a break? Do they want you to do something else?
I think also being able to have some of those conversations outside the context of sex is important, and that is sometimes helpful.
Yeah.
But I also find that hard.
Yeah.
I am now becoming somewhat infamous, I think, for like very long texts to people before I have sex with them. With that kind of hope in mind that like some of this can be talked about ahead of time, like before everybody feels super, super vulnerable. And where someone can be like, yeah, I may or may not come. And, you know, if I want you to do something about it, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
And otherwise, don't worry about it and enjoy yourself.
Right.
Wow. If someone could just say, wow, note to our audience. Please just say that to me sometime.
And that could be like, you know, I'm on antidepressants, so it's hard for me to come right now. Like I had experience with somebody telling me that after the fact, and I was like, and it was somebody who I'd been with before who hadn't been on antidepressants before, and I was like, oh, that was really different. And then they were like, oh, I'm on antidepressants now, so I'm just not going to come. And I was like, okay, that's fine. And it was great I appreciate them giving me that information. Would have been even cooler if they gave me that information beforehand. So like my expectations were a little bit, you know, my sort of expectations of how it all went. Not of them, but like of the situation were a little bit different.
I think we have in general such unfair expectations for ourselves in sex, and that we're just supposed to intuit things.
Exactly.
And we're supposed to be really cool about everything.
Yeah.
And we're supposed to be like both present, but also like really rational and sensitive. And it's just like, no, nobody's going to be like that. Like, can we just talk about things, please?
I want to real quick go back to the sildenafil Viagra thing because I like looked up and what it actually does and what happens if women take it too. So what it actually does is like there's some like receptor blah blah blah, but what it meaningfully does is like relax your muscles and dilates certain kinds of blood vessels so that like more blood goes into parts of your body, your pupils and your penis if you have one, or into your genitals. So for women, if women take it, it would probably lead to increased blood flow to the genitals, more arousal, orgasmic function, quote unquote. You know, it's like similar effects in both cases. And I guess I feel like it's important to talk about what it does a little bit just because of how I think it's like interesting that is so physiological. And my experience with it has been the physiological disruption that drug and other drugs like it provide seems to sort of overcome any psychological disruption that there might be because I guess it's effective enough. So it does like work pretty reliably, and it's like in this country pretty hard to get your hands on because you have to get a prescription. But like, you know, there's nothing wrong with it. Like, it's just a thing that changes the way that your body's working a little bit, and, you know, sort of addresses this challenge that you might be having. So there's that, but also like it's pretty simple what it's doing. And I guess I don't know, I have some, you guys should take it. We'll get back to you.
That's interesting. I would look into that. I have not heard, certainly there's plenty of female-bodied people who would like additional resources and aid in orgasming, and I haven't heard any of them talk about taking Viagra for that purpose. But
Yeah, I've never known. Like, I had heard that it worked on women in a similar way a long time ago, but yeah, anecdotally, I don't think I've ever talked to a woman who has used it that way.
Yeah, and I don't know that it really helps with orgasming necessarily.
Yeah.
I don't think of it doing that for men either.
Oh,
All right, but it helps, with arousal,
Yeah,
I see.
which
could yeah.
it's a stepping stone along the way, right?
Yeah.
Anyway,
I just wanted to say, I didn't quite finish in my list of performance anxiety stuff.
yeah, go back,
I continue
complete your list of
my list.
performance anxiety.
I think that I now just have so much anxiety about having sex with male-bodied people because of this stuff that it interrupts my enjoyment of like getting to know a male-bodied person this way before it's even happened. I'm just like so worried that they're going to be worried. I'm so worried that like something won't go right and they'll be upset and I won't respond to it the right way, or that there's some way I should be responding to it and I'm not. And it just like has gotten really, stressful.
Yeah.
What would you want them to do?
Talk to me about it. I would like them to talk to me about it. I would like them to take up my invitations to talk to them. I would like to know if there's some way I could invite them into those conversations that would feel better than the way I've been trying to do it.
You're inviting them into those conversations and then they're sort of rebuffing your invitations.
Yeah, and like I think sometimes like a bypass, they'll just be like, I just want to make you come. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, that's one thing we could do. Like, what are some other things that we could do? And they'll be like, well, what do you want me to do? And I'm like, but like I just feel sort of like I don't have a partner in it. Like that collaboration isn't there. And then like there's still this kind of subtext that's happening all the time about whether or not we're actually both having a good time.
Right.
So it's like they're not bringing vulnerability
Yeah.
to it. It's like you're bringing all the vulnerability and they're bringing all the pseudo service mentality. Yeah.
I feel like that is like a common sexual dynamic I find myself in with male-bodied people. And frankly, I will be vulnerable again here and say I don't fully understand it, but it's a pattern that I have noticed and I find myself distressed by.
Well, I think it ties back to that like hyper-masculine performance thing. Like, and even if we're not obsessed with how ready to go we are with a rock hard cock at any given moment, we're like the next most sophisticated but still unsophisticated version of that is we're trying to like satisfy our partners, right? And so like
because then that proves that we're worth something to them and we can feel safe there.
yeah, exactly.
Right?
And that is like the definition of our value to them, and we've been stripped of or kind of stripped away our other sort of like our capacity to have other kinds of value. So that's like the easy one.
Yeah, the quantifiable one.
And the harder one would be like actually engaging about like what we wanted.
And then I feel like kind of sometimes I've had partners where I feel sort of like silly with the suggestions that I make, where I'm like, I'm sort of notorious for being like, well, let's just like make out before we have sex like a number of times, you know,
Right.
so that we can like take that pressure off the table. But sometimes I'll just be like, what if we just like had a really strong framing around what we were doing? Like, what if tonight we were only just like jerking each other off? We don't even have to do that, but that's like the limit of what we're going to do. You know, just because I'm trying to explore what it would feel like for there to be like clearer expectations and lower pressure.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sorry
Thank you.
about this.
Thank you.
It sounds amazing to me.
Oh, thank you, Jessica.
Wow, what a dream! Like,
Yeah.
Sounds good, right?
clear communication, boundaries,
Lowered expectations,
no,
like,
yeah,
pressure.
less pressure. Yeah,
And like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, and I know it sounds also scary and difficult. Like, I'm so impressed that you are able to like initiate these conversations. And I think I've always sort of thought of it that like, well, if someone is able to like put it out there, then then you just have to participate,
Yeah, and I think
Seems like that's the hardest
That's
part.
what I was going to say is I've had more luck doing that than I think that you have, and I think that's in part like because I'm a man. And like if a man comes in and is like, let's do this thing, it's like a more traditional for me to like have the like I'm the holder of the desire and the builder
right.
of the container, and I just want us to jerk each other off. I think we should just do that. It just seems like it's easier. It's like more work for you to do that and get a man to
Take it
that you're
seriously?
dating to take it
Right.
seriously and comply or respond to it in a
Or suggest something else. Also fine.
right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's frustrating.
It's really frustrating.
Yeah, and like trying to be like I'm trying to think about how I would respond to a partner doing that, or like the ways that I could hear it as like I might hear it as a rejection.
Yeah, I think that is often the way it's
Yeah.
received. And that's why I like am always trying to like thread the needle in some different way.
Right.
Because I'm like, maybe there's some way to say it that wouldn't be perceived that way. But
Right.
again, I think we get back into the space of like how fragile people's sexual egos are. And I am not an exception to that. Mine is too. The reason why I'm trying all of this is because I'm trying to build it to be more resilient and have better experiences. It's not like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and then they're hearing it as like, wait, you don't want me to fuck you?
Right. What have I done wrong?
You don't want me to like for reals fuck you?
Yeah.
Why not?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or like I've done something wrong and so I'm like correcting them,
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right to be trying that
Thanks.
and to want it. And
Don't give up, you say?
don't give up.
Don't
Yeah.
give
Don't
up.
just
Don't give
go
up.
live on planet Aquarius and
No.
stay there permanently?
No. You
Well-
you could try it with me.
Aw.
Noted. I will.
I know it's different though.
Well, and that it is worth saying that for me personally, a lot of this does just have to do with like trusting someone enough that I believe that we will continue to be in relationship long enough to build a sexual rapport.
Yeah.
And I think like that is, and this is where everyone's like, you're Demi. And I'm like, am I? Okay, fine. Whatever you got to call me. It's fine. But I just want to know that like I'm not being auditioned,
Right.
for whether or not people are going to keep me around. And I'm not
Yeah.
auditioning people in that way either. I think that like sexual rapport builds and improves over time and with trust. And like
Yeah.
it's not my expectation that like things are going to be awesome and perfect right off the bat and that's how I buy more time to get to know you. Like does this make sense?
Yes, it does.
And like you and I have known each other and like been building sexual rapport with each other for 2 decades. And like
Chicken wow wow.
yeah, exactly. And
It's that music, but then Ken Burns style. Like,
photos of us
Like a
as
montage.
20-year-olds. Yeah, Lord.
ew.
God, no.
Okay, anyway, sorry. You were making a genuine.
I was making the
heartfelt
genuine point that like the depth and satisfaction that I experience in our sexual connection only continues to be better because of that, the trust and the context and the knowledge that we're going to keep being together and being intimate with each other, and I don't have to worry that it's
Yeah.
going to be withdrawn if something goes wrong, which then like just puts a bunch of pressure on the entire situation.
There were so many that's what she said jokes in that monologue, but yes. Because I love you, I will forego all of them and
That
say
is a true expression of love. Thank you.
that it's true. And because of that, if, my dick was floppy one time, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, and it would be kind of like funny or whatever. It wouldn't be like a devastating disruption of our entire relationship. And because
we would probably just do something else.
we'd probably just do something else. And because of that, that doesn't happen. And I think that's like kind of like, I think a useful.
Because nobody cares if it happens.
Right.
I think you and I couldn't care less if it happened in either direction, and so it's less likely to happen.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's kind of, what's happening in new relationships where that stuff is happening is you don't have all of that security and all of that rapport and blah, blah, blah. So I guess like the message I want to leave people with is kind of like understand that, give yourself that like grace and generosity and know that that's what you're doing is like building intimacy with people
like
when you're having sex.
That's the whole point. When I was asking that question, like, why are we doing this? That's the why we're doing it. It's not to accumulate orgasms, right?
No.
If that happens, that's nice. But
but it's to build intimacy and get connected to people, and you can do that in a million different ways. And like, there's a lot of different like, frames you can put around that, and games you can play, and limitations. And it's like honestly better as you're building a sexual rapport with new people to
do less
stuff.
I agree.
Like the best experiences I've had is with people where I was like, here's what we shouldn't, like talked about what we don't want to do the first time, or like having an actual boundary. Like, I don't think we should have P&V sex this first time that we're together.
I love that. Wait, there was something else I wanted to say though before we were closing out. Oh, I guess I just wanted to ask the question again of like, what does it mean to be a good lover? After we've sort of explored some of this and some of the ways that we define it in this like high pressured external value type of way. I'm wondering if there's like another definition that we might be circling around as we end today's conversation.
Like being present, and like communicative,
attuned, curious, maybe not even attuned. I would say curious, and vulnerable, and patient.
Are you saying love is patient? Love is kind.
Sorry. Love is a rock hard cup.
Corinthians. Paul's letter to the Corinthians.
All right.
Paul was a nasty motherfucker.
That's what I heard too.
Yeah. Yep. He didn't fall off that horse, if you know what I'm saying. I don't know what that means.
But we're going to go with it.
Yeah.
Maybe one of our listeners knows what it means. All right. Thanks, you two. Thanks for having this conversation with me.
Thanks.
I did not want to have
Thanks
it.
for relenting and doing
And
the
you were
episode.
right. And I'm glad we did. And this was really good.
Thank you for listening to Mistakes Were Made. You can follow us on Instagram at MistakesCast, and Sarah has been putting a bunch of great resources on the Instagram, so you should definitely follow it. I always say it at the end of every episode, but this time I actually mean it. Ooh. Go on Instagram if you have an Instagram account and find at MistakesCast and follow it, and then you'll see stuff that Sarah put on there. It's mostly like resources from and posts from other people in the stories.
And right? I, just as a way of making it a fun visual, I often find myself doing that when I'm in the bath.
Ooh.
And I'm like, it's true.
Really?
So you can go to MistakesCast on Instagram and see what I've been posting there, and then just picture me posting it from the bath.
Whoa. Okay, I'm going to.
I'm going to build followers one way or another.
All right. Yeah. And slide into our DMs for pictures of Sarah in the bath.
Yeah. Are we getting a bath selfie or what?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, but we have to clean the bathroom first, Alex.
Okay. Never mind. Deal's off.
Only when we get a certain number of followers.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. When we get 1,000 followers.
I'll clean the bathroom.
Selfie. She'll clean the bathroom and I'll take pictures.
All right.
Okay.
Bye,
Thanks,
y'all.
guys. Bye.
Thanks.